Welcome back, everybody, to another great week. It's that time of the week again. It is lecture time. This week's topic is going to be on shifts in supply and demand and kind of a follow up lecture from the first two supply and demand lectures. So enjoy. I hope you learn a little bit today, and I'll see you guys next week. Welcome back, everybody, to another week of lecture. This week we're going to be covering a topic of shifts in supply and demand. This is kind of a continuation of the last two lectures in the economics series. So, in our previous supply and demand lecture, the focus was on the basics, and the diagrams were depicted for a fixed price and quantity combination. And this was for both curves. So essentially, this means that it was in a strict space for a single set of combinations of price and quantity, but this can change. So a shift occurs when a factor affecting supply or demand is altered, and we'll cover some of these a little bit later. Is the change in either supply or demand themselves, and this shows us a parallel shift. So a rightward shift of either the supply or demand curve, doesn't matter which one, indicates a positive shock has affected it. A leftward shift, however, of either curve indicates a negative shock which has affected it. So to further investigate this, we need to look at four laws of supply and demand, and we need to be pretty familiar with these in order to properly analyze what's going on in each situation. So the first is that demand is downward sloping, and we've covered this before. So essentially, as price increases, quantity decreases. And likewise, supply is upward sloping. As price increases, quantity increases. Buyers, demanders are price takers, which is number 3. And the last one is that both buyers and sellers maximize the amount they buy or sell. So we'll start by talking about 4 basic cases, and then we'll move to some more complex examples where both curves shift at the same time. So for the first one, we're going to see where demand shifts right. And again, this is a positive change when it shifts to the right. So again, we shouldn't forget to label our units here. And I've put the supply and demand on here, and we can see the shift to the right and upward of the demand curve. And we can see the new equilibrium has a higher quantity and a higher price. And we'll see how this compares in a moment. So rightward shifts in general in both supply and demand ensure that the market quantity is higher, as we saw, for a fixed market price. This signifies a positive change. And we can also have positive changes in price or negative changes based on whether the supply moves or not. So the second one we're going to be looking at is a right shift in the supply curve. And this looks like a downward shift, and it's also to the right, as it is indicated here. So you can see here it kind of looks like a downward shift. And the equilibrium is going to be at a lower price point and at a higher quantity. So we can see the price change is inverted, whether demand or supply shifts right. So supply and demand have opposite change in the price level when shifted in isolation. And this will be important when we look at the more complex cases. The third one, we're going to now look at left shifts. So we'll first look at demand. Again, label your units, very important. And here we have a left shift in the demand, which is down and to the left. The equilibrium here, you can see I'm struggling to draw the line. The equilibrium has a lower quantity than before and also a lower price, which is opposite of when it shifts to the right, which is to be expected. In general, leftward shifts have the property of lowering the market quantity for a fixed price level. This is for both the supply and demand, and it signifies a negative change for the market, so it's a negative catalyst. And finally, we can look at when the supply shifts to the left. And this looks like a shift upward and to the left for the supply curve here. So again, the equilibrium has a lower quantity, as it did with the left shift of the demand curve, but a higher price, which is the inverse of the demand curve. And the price shift here is the opposite as for a positive rightward shift of either curve. So you can go back and look at those as well. So now we can take a look at 4 cases where it's a little bit more complex in that both curves will be shifting but by different amounts and in different directions. So the first is when demand shifts to the right more than the supply shifts to the left. Again, don't forget your units, very important here. Here we can see the supply and the demand as usual, and we have the supply shifting less than the demand, and the supply shifting left, demand is shifting right. And here we can see a positive quantity change and a positive price change when this occurs. It's important to note too that when both shift in opposite directions the same amount, there will not be a quantity change. There will only be a price change. So you can graph this yourself and try it out and see if you can get this to work. The second case we're going to look at is when demand shifts right less than the supply shifts to the left. So here I've kind of copy and pasted the same diagram for time constraints here, but we can see the demand curve shifts to the right less than the supply shifts to the left. And again, we can see a higher price level, but this time we have a smaller quantity in this case. So we can see it depends on the amount it shifts. The third one we're going to look at is demand shifts to the left more than supply shifts to the right. So here we see that right shift of the supply, which is smaller than the left shift of the demand. And again, we have that the quantity falls and the price falls as well. So here you can see the shift with the arrows. And the last case we're going to look at is when demand shifts to the left less than supply shifts to the right. So again, here we can see a bigger shift in supply to the right and a smaller shift of demand to the left. And I've indicated all the new equilibria with a yellow highlighter. So here a higher quantity happens and a lower price, which is the opposite. So it's important to note here also that when demand shifts to the left and supply shifts to the right, the price always falls, but the quantity change depends on how much they shift. And this is very important and can easily be tested on an exam as well. So it's also useful to note that when both shift right equal amounts, so by equal amounts, there's only a quantity change in this case. The price will remain the same. So you should try this yourself again. And this is the opposite of when it shifts to the right. I also recommend that when you're doing this at home, do one curve at a time, one shift, and then do the other one. And do them separately at first to see how they work and how each shift affects the overall picture. And then finally, we're going to take a look at what's very important to know what causes these shifts. So shifts in demand can be caused by, in both directions, income changes, increase or decreases, taste or preference changes, population increases or decreases, price of related goods such as complements and substitutes, which we'll talk about in another video, and expectations of consumers. Supply, on the other hand, shifts and is caused by changes in input prices to production. Some natural disasters may have impacts on this, new technology developments, and government policies such as taxation. So when we combine the 3 supply and demand lectures, we know how to analyze them now and study positive and negative changes for each curve and be able to shift them and see how these changes unfold.